Hello. Today I'm going to talk about us and them. That's to say, Britain and Europe as I think it's rather wrongly known. In other words, the various institutions that have led to European unity. Finishing up, of course, with the EU, which we left as a result of the referendum of the eventual fraught result of the referendum of 2016, and the ancestral institutions, the European Coal and Steel Community, and established actually coming into practice in 1952, but established by the Treaty of Paris of 1951, and before that the famous Schumann Declaration of the 9th of May 1950, and after the, as it's always known, the ECSC, after that the European Economic Community, established by, listen to it carefully, the Treaty of Rome, signed on the 25th of March 1957. 25th of March, Rome. That's Lady Day in English. That's to say, the Feast of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. That central doctrine of if you like, Mariolatry, the worship, the centrality of the Virgin Mary to the Roman Catholic Church. Worth just emphasising that point, that is where the actual foundation moment of the common market takes place. In that place, Rome, on that day of supreme significance to Roman Catholicism. That, of course, that thought always lay in the back of my mind when I was one of the very first to talk about Britain's leaving the EU as being very much like Henry VIII's break with Rome, that first Brexit, as I labelled it. As I pointed out, the EU, like the Roman Church, was a deliberately supranational organisation with its own language, Latin, its own system of law, its own system of values, its claim actually to the superiority for much of the time in the Middle Ages is actual enforcement of a judicial superiority over the mere states, the mere kings and emperors of Europe, the mere secular authority, this superior international claim to a power deriving emphatically not from the people but from God. Henry VIII breaking with that and rupturing it. And it was always, I suppose, in the back of my own mind that this was central to an idea of Englishness, to, I suppose, my own identity and my own sense of the place of Britain and England in the world, which is why finally, out of a kind of sense of historical self-vindication, I was somewhat hesitant to begin with Brexiteer. Am I still hesitant? Do I have quitters' regrets? Buyers' regrets? Was I sold a false prospectus? Well, there are elements undoubtedly that were false, but generally speaking, no. But always, I've been in this series of talks, in this series of videos, I've been emphasising the importance, the supreme importance of evidence. So far, I've given you kind of a historian's hunch, you could almost say. So I decided to do what you always should do, test prejudices. I decided to go back and do what I'd never done before and look seriously at those foundation moments, at the foundation documents. And what I'm going to talk about today in particular is that extraordinary moment on the 9th of May 1950, the Schumann Declaration and the background to it and what surrounded it. It's a remarkable story. In the background, of course, is the key figure of European unity, that extraordinary Frenchman born in Cognac, where the booze comes from, to a family that actually ran a cognac house, Jean Monnet. We're familiar, aren't we, thanks to the remarkable work of David Goodhart, with the idea of somewheres and anywheres. That's to say, somewheres, people firmly rooted to the spot, the typical peasant or like my own family, the industrial worker in a two up, two down in a town like Oldham in the north of England, and then the anywheres. Well, I suppose really, but people like me, those who are at home wherever, float around between city and city, university and university, country and country. Well, Jean Monnet was very much both. Very important. He was a Frenchman, and like many Frenchmen, he came from a family with two traditions on either side of the family, the female and the male. The females of the Monnet family were deeply serious, deeply committed, passionate Roman Catholics. The males, on the other hand, were in the full French Republican tradition of laïcism, that rigorous insistence on a separation of church and state, which survives from the late 19th century right through to the presidency of President Macron today. So he's both of these things, and of course firmly rooted in Charente, at Cognac. But the rest of his life, his extraordinary life, he is the complete anywhere. In fact, he's a complete everywhere. He interrupts his French education to move to London, to learn the business of the Cognac House. In the First World War, he's a central figure in Anglo-French relations, campaigning, or really quite a young man, campaigning for a union between England, between Britain, the British Empire, and France to face down the German menace. In the aftermath of the First World War, he becomes Assistant General Secretary of the League of Nations in Geneva, that kind of doomed forerunner, because there wasn't American participation, that doomed forerunner of the United Nations. And then in the rest of the 20s, his career gets stranger and stranger and arguably wilder and wilder. He goes to New York. He becomes inevitably a merchant banker. And then he returns to Europe, using his banking expertise in Poland, in Romania, bringing about currency stabilization. He is married, extraordinarily enough, in Moscow. The woman that he marries is, I'm afraid, an Italian, very serious Catholic, but unfortunately she's already married and she's got a daughter, and of course the Catholic Church does not recognize divorce. So what does she do? She takes out short-term Russian citizenship and takes advantage of the uniquely, at that point, loose, lax divorce laws of the Soviet state. So they're married in Moscow. And then he goes off, and by the way, he had actually arrived in Moscow from China, because he's spending 5 years in the 1930s, between 1932 and 1935, 37. He's spending this stretch of time in China, working for the Republican government of China that rules China between the fall of the empire and the struggle with Mao Zedong that brings about Chinese communism. And what he's doing there, he's running a kind of international development authority, which is responsible for trying to kickstart the Chinese economy. This economy, of course, which was also being shaped by the international concessions in particularly surrounding Shanghai, which had been made a free port in the aftermath of the First World War, and also, of course, the huge linkage between Shanghai and the British colony of Hong Kong. So this supranational structure imposed on the old-fashioned, creaking, unmodernized economy of China. In the Second World War, he is again a central figure in Anglo-French relations. When France falls, when de Gaulle goes off on his own, he abandons that attempt, and he's sent off by Churchill, again, back to America, where he becomes the agent, one of the principal agents in leveraging supplies from Roosevelt's government. And he also becomes an advisor to Roosevelt. And in short, he really becomes the Americans' favourite Frenchman. Very important to remember. So this is the figure, this extraordinary figure who draws up the plan, the scheme behind the Schumann Declaration, the declaration by Robert Schumann. At this point, he played in the aftermath of the Second World War. He was instrumental in the management of the Marshall Plan, and then he becomes the head of the new economic planning commission in France itself. What is the key thing, the key instrument of the Schumann proposal, which of course is going to lay the foundations for the coal and steel community, the European coal and steel community? The key element of it all is a very extraordinary thing. It's called the high authority. What a very grand term. Well, it was a grand term for a grand concept. The idea is that the heart of the community wouldn't be a meeting of government ministers drawn from the various countries that would form it. Instead, it would be a supranational authority, just like the kind of thing that he'd been dealing with in China, that would indeed contain representatives, but expert, in other words, people very, very much like Monnet himself, who will become the first chairman of the high authority, but experts who would, well, they'd manage things, they would sort things out. But the most extraordinary thing is they would have sovereign authority actually to tell the states what to do. I think this clearly reflects Monnet's experience of the, as he saw it, the repeated failure of the nation states to do the right thing, to unite Britain and France in the First World War, for America to come into the League of Nations in the aftermath, for China to sort out its economy before the horrors of the descent into communism, for the failure of, again, Anglo-French relations in the Second World War, that repetition, him at the heart of that process in the Second World War, just as much as he'd been in the First, and so on and so on. So it's the failure, in his view, of the nation state, and therefore the need for a corrective. And that corrective is to be an empowered technocracy, a group of anywheres who don't draw their power from the people from below. They draw their power from what? Well, their own expertise, some form of submission to it by the power of states. In short, it's a power, and this again goes back to that strange mixture of Monnet's own life, very similar to that of the medieval papacy. The idea that you have a superior, quasi-judicial authority set over the merely earthly, mortal, brutal, sweaty powers of kings and emperors. And that is the idea. You can tell why it's somewhat controversial. So this plan, this idea, is come up with in the strictest secrecy in April 1950, and there is then the intention to reveal it to what is going to be a deeply surprised world in the press conference on the 9th of May. Certain people are taken into confidence before that. The Germans are taken into confidence. The idea of bringing, as it were, German resources, particularly resources of coal, to fuel French industry, particularly French steel, was at the actual heart of the plan. So the Germans, Konrad Adenauer, is taken. He's very keen on it because it will recognise Germany still quasi at the apron strings of the Allies, still under military occupation and so on, still indeed with the Tsar, with the Saar, S-A-R-R, and the Saarland actually being controlled by France, who is very, very reluctant to give it up. So for Adenauer, this represents an opening door for Germany to rejoin the community of free nations. The Americans are consulted. Very conspicuous people are not consulted. Schumann only tells the French cabinet, the cabinet of which he was a member, the government of which he was a member, about the scheme on the morning of the 9th. The Prime Minister Bidault is clearly shell-shocked. He's finally brought round. The cabinet is sort of brought round. I mean, more, I think, out of surprise and willing consent, but very conspicuously, extraordinarily, the French Parliament, the alleged grounding of because the Fourth Republic has a parliamentary constitution, loosely modelled on the British, but the Parliament is not consulted at all. In other words, there is a deliberate and absolute, not simply marginalisation by the nature of the high authority, a kind of technocratic supranational authority. There's not simply a marginalisation of the democratic or the popular or the national process by that. There is a deliberate exclusion of the democratic process, that's to say the French Parliament, from any even foreknowledge of the scheme. They're not even asked to approve it. They don't even know that it exists. And the most surprising thing of all, of course, is the timing of the press conference. It's at 6 o'clock in the evening. Hardly anybody has time to turn up to listen to this extraordinary statement, which again, the supranational authority with the sovereign powers, the careful avoidance of any kind of contamination by the by the democratic process, and then finally the absolutely explicit statement in the Schumann Declaration of its long-term aims. And they are as follows. This is the official translation. Through the consolidation of basic production and institution of a new high authority, listen carefully, whose decisions will bind France, Germany and the other countries that join, this proposal represents the first concrete steps towards a European federation imperative for the preservation of peace. There you have it. This is why the 9th of May has been declared the foundation day of Europe, the European Union. It's why Jean Monnet himself was declared to be the first citizen of Europe. And what you can now see is, in embryo, in this moment of foundation, is everything that has characterised the European Union from the whole process to European Union through the common market from that point onwards. The elevation of a technocratic authority, the marginalisation of democracy, the insistence on a very clear federal goal right from the beginning. The idea of federalism was not an add-on, it was the fundamental goal. This is what philosophers call a teleological process. The business of setting up the coal and steel community was there with a purpose, and the purpose was its end result, its intended result, which was to be European Union. That is all there. It is indisputable, it is clear, it is certain, it is embedded forcibly and absolutely in the evidence. But of course, hardly anybody had heard the press conference. And the scene in the Salle de l'Horloge, the great chamber of the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry, was sadly underpopulated. So in a note of farce in this high drama, the entire press conference had to be rerun artificially so that you could have a decent photograph of Monsieur Schumann delivering the speech to an appropriately large and adoring audience. And the thing that is always pervaded as this foundation moment of Europe is in fact not the photograph of what actually happened on the 9th, rather sparsely attended. It is the carefully staged reconstruction. So another element that we can perhaps add to Europe is a certain foundation of Europe, is a certain fundamental dishonesty. What a cruel word. But remember, Plato talked about the noble lie, that myth that is necessary to keep the ordinary people in line, the poor somewheres in line by the great anywheres. That too is built into that foundation moment of Europe. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session. suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.